I want to thank Walter Neusel for his bestowal of this award to make possible the Peter-Singer-Preis for strategies to reduce animal suffering. I was both surprised and honoured when he contacted me, I suppose about 4 years ago, and told me that he was thinking of setting up this prize and awarding a medal which bears my likeness, although I suppose as the years go by the likeness starts to diminish. But I'm deeply honoured that he has set up a prize using my name to honour people who have made very distinctive contributions to reducing animal welfare, and I'm grateful to Walter for doing so. And I say not only because the prize honours people in this area, but also because it brings us together, brings together a group of people who are concerned with these issues, to spend a little bit of time together, to eat a meal together, to talk, and to think about these questions of how can we best advance the cause of reducing animal suffering. And I thank Stefan Eck for his excellent talk just now, which gave us some insights into the strategies that he's pursuing in terms of reducing animal suffering. So when it comes to, sorry, my computer's just decided to go to sleep. So when it comes to my good friend and fellow Australian Philip Wallen, I do think that he's an excellent recipient for this award in the tradition that has now been established. He's, as Walter said, he's the 4th recipient, and he's taken an interestingly different course to those of the others who essentially were, well, I was the first recipient as a writer and philosopher, and then we had Ingrid Newkirk, who founded an organisation, and Melanie Joy as well, both a combination of that, if you like, an author and starting an organisation to pursue those ideas. Philip's path was a somewhat different one, so let me tell you a little bit about that for those not familiar with what he's done. Philip was born in Bangalore in India and came to Australia as a teenager, and he pursued a career in banking, working with Citibank, becoming at the age of 34 a vice president of Citibank, and by the time he was 40 he had established his own advisory firm and had acquired a significant amount of wealth. And of course, for many people, acquiring wealth is the end that they pursue for its own sake, and once they have acquired wealth, even when they have acquired sufficient wealth basically to look after themselves and their family for the rest of their lives, they nevertheless go on pursuing more wealth, as if somehow they were playing one of those games where the more you get, the more you win. But Philip clearly, at some point, perhaps I don't know, perhaps all along, had been thinking that this is not the be-all and end-all of life, acquiring wealth. So at about this time, when he was around 40, he decided that he would start giving it away. In fact, as he said, what he decided to go in to do was what he called reverse tithing. You've all heard of tithing in the traditional Christian tradition and other religions as well. Tithing means you give 10% of what you earn. Philip did that in reverse. He kept 10% of his wealth and decided to give the 90% away. And among the things that he gave it to, essentially, Philip's idea was that he wanted to promote kindness. So he set up the Winsome Constance Kindness Trust, named after his mother and his grandmother. And its mission statement was to promote kindness towards all other living beings and enshrine it as a recognisable trait in the Australian character and consciousness. And he certainly has been promoting kindness to all other living beings, and I want to describe some of the things he's done. Whether he's succeeded in establishing it as a recognisable trait in the Australian consciousness is a little more difficult to say. I'd say yes, Australians like to think of themselves as being kind, but certainly we are not kind in everything we do, and we are especially not kind to all living creatures. But let's look at some of the things that it's done. The Trust has promoted projects all over the world, not just in Australia. To give you some examples of things that it's done to reduce the suffering of animals, he sponsors the anti-whaling vessel, the Sea Shepherd, which does its best, sometimes with a considerable risk to its crew, to make life difficult for those who are trying to kill whales, in particular for the Japanese whaling fleet. You might have seen videos of the Sea Shepherd harassing the Japanese whaling ships in the Antarctic, for example, and elsewhere. And Philip is a major funder that makes those activities possible. In Korea, as probably most people in this room know, dogs are regarded by some people as food. Well, you might say, so they think of dogs as food, we think of pigs as food. Is there really anything but a cultural difference here? And Philip did not go out to do something about this simply because they were dogs, and many of us care more about dogs, but because it is also a belief among some Koreans that a dog who has been beaten to death offers more tender meat than a dog who has been simply humanely killed. And that's what makes the Korean dog markets particularly egregious, and why Philip has supported groups that are trying to stop that. In China, Philip has supported efforts to stop the bile bear industry, the industry which takes moon bears, cages them in cages essentially so small that they can't really move, gives them permanent indwelling catheters to collect the bile, which is used for traditional Chinese medical products, and perhaps most terrific of all, to prevent the bears harming their keepers, smashes their teeth and chops off their fingers. But nobody could point to Philip and say, he just cares about animals. Why doesn't he care about people as well? Because it's very clear that he does. And the Trust has done many things to help people. After the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, which killed more than 200,000 people, the Constant Trust helped victims of that tragedy. It supports an orphanage in Bangalore, the city of Phil's birth, as I mentioned, started by a man named John Sampson, who found a 2-year-old child who had basically been thrown into a filthy rubbish bin and was starving. And Sampson decided to take in that child and eventually other abandoned children, many of them with disabilities, both physical and mental, and therefore rejected, and to try to look after them and do the best he could for them. And that has now been going for so long with Phil's support that the original 2-year-old found in the trash is now a qualified pharmacist. And many of the other children who were abandoned have also done well educationally. In particular, Phil and his wife Trix, who I should mention is part of this joint work that they do together, are interested in projects that can combine help for both humans and animals. In northern India, there is an ethnic group known as the Kalanda people, who traditionally have walked around parts of rural India with bears who dance, and then they collect money for the performance of the bears in dancing. The bears don't dance because they happen to enjoy dancing. They dance because they were captured as cubs, their mothers were killed, their nostrils were enlarged with a hot toka, glass was then put in their nostrils, and a cord was put through the nostrils so that when you pull on the cord, they're basically in pain. and they learn that that's released if they dance. So as an attempt to solve this, there's an organisation, again with Phil's support, that is offering the calendar people an exchange. If they will give up their bears, who will then be taken to a sanctuary where they can live out their lives in much more pleasant circumstances. If they will give up their bears, they will be given the opportunities to start a business. Some capital to start off some business, like starting a small vegetable shop or some little business of that sort, so they can settle down, they don't have to wander, and that of course also means that they can have a better life, they can educate their children. Also in India, Phil has paid for retirement homes for cows. As you know, Indians regard cows as sacred and don't kill them, but that doesn't mean that they give them good lives. On the contrary, very often they're hard worked and poorly fed. So this organisation that he's funding is, takes the cows to a retirement home, uses their dung to produce biogas, which can be turned into cooking gas, and the remaining waste can be used as fertiliser. So again, benefits for the cows and for humans. And another project he's funding is trying to reduce the incidence of rabies by capturing, neutering and vaccinating street dogs, or if you like, community dogs who are looked after in a community, and returning them to the community where they are. Now you might say, isn't that going to cost a lot of money? Whereas it would be a lot cheaper, obviously, just to euthanize the dogs, to put them down. But Phil doesn't want to do that, and also believes that it's more effective actually to return them to their territory, because the dogs are territorial. And if you kill them all, there's a vacant territory, more dogs will move in, those dogs may carry rabies, so you actually get a better outcome by making sure the dogs do not get rabies and then returning them to the neighbourhood. So all of these things are done in accordance with Phil's philosophical outlook, which is one that I share, which is when it comes to suffering, the species of a being doesn't really matter. We are capable of suffering, and it's a bad thing when humans, oppressed, underprivileged humans, suffer. Non-human animals are capable of suffering too, and that's also a bad thing and something that we should try to prevent. Phil and I agree that this is a fundamentally important moral issue. He's described it as the most important moral issue since we ended slavery. How exactly we rank it alongside slavery, racism, sexism, and the other big issues of the day, no doubt is something that one could discuss and have different opinions on. But what clearly is true is that it's a very neglected moral issue. Despite the efforts of the animal rights movement over the last 45 years, still this issue does not get the kind of automatic public attention that issues about racism, for example, get. And so it's very much worth our work to try to end it, because we can make a contribution, in a sense a proportionally bigger contribution, each one of us, because there are fewer people who are aware of and working on this issue. Phil has, I think, a great gift for words, which has made him not only effective through the money that he's able to donate, but a very effective speaker and advocate for animals. I had the pleasure about 6 years ago, I think it was, of being on the same side as Phil on a debate that was held in the Melbourne Town Hall before a very large audience, maybe 2,000 to 3,000 people filling the town hall. And the proposition that we were defending and the opposite side was opposing was animals should not be on the menu. And I did my best to make that argument, but I think there's no doubt that the speech that captured people's imagination that evening was Phil's, and you can fortunately still go and see it on YouTube. If you put in animals should be off the menu and Phil Wallen, I think you'll rapidly find it. It's had something close to 700,000 views now, and I think a very good argument, giving a lot of different reasons for why animals should not be on our plate. Phil is, of course, a vegan and believes in the principle of non-violence, rather like that Ben Moore talked about, not harming beings, describes himself as an ahimsan, maybe not living quite as low as the ahimsan Jains. I guess if you want to live that low on the planet, he wouldn't have been able to fly over here and accept the award. But we have to think about the good we can do through travelling in the world as well, and maybe there is some compensating benefits for that. And the other thing I want to mention, because I've noticed in my years working with people working for animals and also people working for people and what's now known as the effective altruism movement, that most of the people who do this, who I know, do not see it as a sacrifice. They don't think, oh well, this is a duty, this is an obligation that I have to do because the world is so bad, and I wish I didn't have to. I wish I could have, relaxed, kept my money, sat on the beach, or whatever else it might be. On the contrary, the people that I know who are doing this generally find it a fulfilling and worthwhile thing to do. Ben Moore said in his talk, there are no purposes in the universe as such, and I share that view, that evolution does not have a purpose, but that we are the ones who have purposes. And I think, in fact, we are beings who have evolved to have purposes. Perhaps, for most of our ancestors' history, those purposes were confined to getting enough food to eat, surviving, warding off predators, and of course, reproducing. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. But we are still purposive beings, and when we find purposes, important purposes, purposes that match our values so that we can think we're living in harmony with our values, that's really important. And a journalist asked Phil if he's happier than he used to be before he decided to give his money away. And this is his reply. Yes, happy is an odd word. I feel a sense of joy in every second of every day because I know how precious and fleeting every second of life is. We deprive others of their lives at our own moral peril. I have great delight in recommending and nominating Phil Wallen for the Peter-Singer-Prize for strategies to reduce animal suffering. Phil, you're a most worthy recipient of this award.